Well, I want to welcome you to a seminar, Prophecies of Hope. This is really an exciting seminar. We'll be going through some of the most important prophecies for our time. You know, we live in a time of crisis. Mankind faces some of the biggest problems that it's ever faced. And these problems are not so easily solved. In fact, some of them seem almost insoluble. And so we're left really with the question, where are we heading? You know, where is all this going? And tonight I want to start off by giving you an outline of some of the issues that we face. Before we even begin this outline, we just have to say that there are many, many more issues. This is just a taste, so that we can understand part of the magnitude, but the magnitude of our crisis today is much larger than this even. The first crisis that I want to look at is really the problem with a limited number of resources. You know, if you look at the number of resources that we're using today, it is simply unsustainable for us to continue using the resources like we're using. Humans use 30% more resources than is sustainable. And scientists say that by the year 2030, we will need a whole new planet to sustain the levels of resource use that we're using today. So we're living beyond our means. We're borrowing from tomorrow. The UN came out with a report several years ago, I think in 2008, saying that we have only one planet. Its capacity to support a thriving diversity of species, humans included, is large but fundamentally limited. When humans' demand on this capacity exceeds what is available, when we surpass ecological limits, we erode the health of the Earth's living systems. Ultimately, this loss threatens human well-being. So if we continue using resources like we're using them today, we are going to meet a wall in which we're not going to be able to supply our needs. And there will be scarcity. And that scarcity is going to affect food, it's going to affect energy, it's going to affect many different aspects of our lives if we don't change the way we're using those resources. And our whole society really is built up to use the resources in the way that they're being used. I mean, our whole economy here is built on the idea of using more and more resources. There is no concerted effort to limit the amount of resources that we're using, not at all. In fact, our growth models for our economy are built on the idea that we have to continue to grow. So how are we going to change this? Is it possible for mankind to change this? Or are we really heading down a road that will lead to this wall where scarcity becomes a reality in our lives? I mean, we have not experienced scarcity, at least not in my lifetime. But it seems like in the near distant future, even America is going to be facing scarcity. And that means not enough food on the food shelves. It means hunger. It means possible famine and really dire straits. We're not talking about way in the future. We're talking about in the near future. So this is one of the crises that mankind faces together. And the question is this really soluble? Or is this the new reality? It's also interesting to look at just the enormous amounts of stuff that we're consuming as a population here in America compared to other countries. For example, we're 5% of the population of the world, and yet we use 1/3 of the world's paper. Can you believe that? I mean, that's just hard to comprehend. We use 1/4 of the world's oil. We use 23% of the world's coal, 27% of aluminum, and 19% of copper. So we're using a lot more resources than other countries are using. Why is this? Can this be changed? This tells me that we are more responsible for this irresponsible use of resources than other countries are. There should be enough resources for all humans on this planet, but it's the way in which we're using it that's causing the problems. Another major crisis that we're facing is really climate change. Now, this is uniformly recognized as an issue, although there are different explanations for why these changes are taking place and what this actually means for mankind. One of the facts that I would like to just point out is that the ice sheets on our poles are melting at an incredibly fast rate. Massive ice sheets at opposite ends of the Earth are melting at an unprecedented rate. The ice on the North Pole is actually melting very quickly, about 120 cubic miles of ice every year. And since 2009, this has actually doubled, and in some places it's tripled. So we're talking about it melting very, very quickly. You know, this will have consequences for the oceans and the rising of the oceans. And as this process continues, there's a speeding up because more and more of the ocean becomes visible, and the ocean actually absorbs the rays of the sun instead of reflecting them out. And so that contributes to the heating and then to the increased melting. So this is going to have profound impact on the oceans and the cities on the coast, which will be inundated by the water. But we're talking then about a heating up process. And this heating up process is affecting our global, climate. It's affecting the air currents, impacting certain regions with not enough water, other regions with too much water. It's affecting the oceans. It's affecting the animals. So it's having a profound impact on every aspect of our lives. One of the aspects that I think is just really shows you the profound impact that the changes are having is really the dying off of insects. In Germany, they've done research that recently indicates that in the last 3 decades, they have actually lost about 75% of their insect population. Now, often we hear in the news that bees are dying off. But this research is indicating that this extinction is happening with all the insects. Now, the evidence doesn't clearly link it to climate change. In fact, it may be linked to our use of pesticides. It may be linked to other things. But this is happening at an extremely fast rate, and this is bound to have an impact on the whole ecosystem, including human beings. The next crisis that I think we really have to think seriously about, because this will impact us in the short term, is really the overuse of antibiotics and the fact that this is creating antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now, UK experts, they say that we're really ending the era of safe medicine. I mean, this just sounds so unbelievable. We've taken for granted that when you go into the hospital, you're going to get help. But if we don't have antibiotics to fight bacteria, going into the hospital can be actually a death sentence. We don't have any other options at this point. Scientists are trying to find other options, but there aren't many other options. So if we don't have antibiotics to treat people, then common injuries and infections, minor problems, can lead to death. So think for a second, if you get a little cut, you may not be able to get treatment for your cut, and that could lead to much more serious things. So we're going into a post-antibiotic era, and this will have major, devastating effects on our whole healthcare system and our ability to treat disease and to help people with any kind of a problem. So, I mean, what could this lead to? This could lead to, lots of sickness and disease killing people. Things that today we write off as minor. So this is one of the crises that mankind is facing in the near future. The next crisis is actually really happening as we speak, but will only grow, and that is the disparity between the rich and the poor. You know, the richest 1% of the world's population has more wealth than the rest of mankind. This seems totally unfair, and you have to wonder, how did we come to that point? Now, of course, that has something to do with the different industries that are producing wealth, but it also has something to do with the way the government is dealing with this wealth, the tax rates and all that. Now, US is an example of inequality, more so than many other Western countries. In fact, if we look at some of the statistics, it's unbelievable to see that we're actually more unequal today than we were in 1928. So we're more unequal than a period of time when inequality was really very great. You know, the upper 1/5 of the population has about 59.1% of all the income here in the States. The upper 1/5 holds about 88.9% of the wealth. So we're talking about a very unequal society. And this will be a profound cause of social unrest and other issues if this continues to grow. Another issue that is impacting us and is creating, I believe, crisis is that after 9/11, America became a surveillance state. And that is that America became very involved in tracking people, in watching the communications going on between people, using sophisticated technology to spy on both citizens and non-citizens, governments, politicians, all in an attempt to somehow protect America from future terrorism, protect America from war. So in the name of protection, we've actually given up our right to privacy, our right to express things without other people knowing what we're saying. Now this undermines the basis for freedom of speech, and it also impacts the government's ability to circumvent different constitutional protections that we have without anybody knowing it. So this can create crisis, deeper crisis in the future when there are forms of expression that the state finds to be subversive. Forms which may not be subversive, but if politicians perceive them as being subversive, the government could crack down on those forms of speech and use this surveillance state to actually penalize people for expressing those opinions between themselves. So this really undermines the basis for our freedom. Now, right now, most people accept it. They may question it, but they've accepted it because they don't see a lot of negative results. But in the future, if America is pressured, this could actually lead to many arrests. It could lead to many people suffering unjustly. So this is, in my mind, a crisis because we're actually going down a path that leads to less freedom. Now, since 2013, we've just experienced, a great deal of refugees coming from Africa, coming from Syria and the Middle East. Actually, about 51 million people are today formally displaced from their homes by conflict and human rights abuse. It's really the highest number recorded since World War II. I think the second highest number goes back to the wars in the Balkans and the genocide in Rwanda and Eastern Congo. So we're talking about millions of people being displaced, and this is having a profound effect on people's perceptions of immigration, which is in turn affecting the politics. Nations are closing their borders. Nations are changing their social benefits. Nations are becoming more anti-immigrant. And so this is really affecting our attitudes towards each other, our attitudes towards the external world. So I believe that this is another form of crisis, because what it's doing is it's causing us to go down a path which leads in a certain direction, away from openness, away from a willingness to help other people. And so this is actually making us more closed-minded, less caring, less concerned with other people. And so we're seeing the rise of anti-immigration, we're seeing the rise of prejudices that are very deep in our culture. So this is, in fact, a kind of a crisis that could become worse if the immigration problem becomes worse. And we know that we're facing the issue of scarcity. And if the scarcity issue continues to increase, there will be even more refugees fleeing from their countries because they don't have basic human needs. So I think this is something definitely to watch in the future, and can create insecurity, national insecurity. As immigrants try to come to Europe, it could create conflict. Another crisis that is up and coming, that's been developing ever since World War II, I would say, is really the erosion of the wall between church and state. Now, we hold this to be very dear because we know from history that when church and state begin to work together, it limits our freedoms to think freely and to believe according to our convictions. And the Constitution protects these rights very, very strongly. But in the last years, the Christian community and the secular community have both been actively trying to impose their own moral agendas on society. And there's been a cultural clash between the church and secular society, which is creating a conflict and a crisis. Because the secular community is wanting to impose its version of morality, and the Christian community wants to impose its version, and those two are bound to clash with each other. And both of them are trying to protect their own rights. The church is becoming more and more proactive in trying to influence what's going on with the laws. And I think this is very dangerous because the religious community, has its own morality. And if that morality is imposed upon society, I believe it's contrary both to what our government stands for, the fact that we've been given rights to think freely, but also it's dangerous because it really undermines Christianity's principle of freedom. When you look at the New Testament, and I would say the whole Old Testament too, God is God of freedom. We can go back to the story of the Exodus. The people of Israel were under slavery. They were forced to build the pyramids, build the nation of Egypt as slaves, being slaves to the religious and the political system. And God stepped in. He freed Israel from slavery. Slavery not only to the political system, but also slavery to the religious system. And he brought them out into the desert, and he gave them experiences with himself, and created a relationship with them, and then he asked them to follow his laws. Really, he was giving them a choice. And this choice was a choice to either follow him or go back, because they had a choice to go back if they wanted to. They were constantly complaining along in their journey, wanting to go back, but they continued to go forward. So God gave them a choice to serve him and to follow him. And we actually read that they made a covenant with God. They made an agreement with God that they would follow him and they would serve him because of the great love that he had shown them, and the fact that he had proved himself to be more powerful and more real than all the other gods. So we see there in that story this principle of freedom. God taking Israel out of slavery, introducing them to himself, giving them the choice to choose who they were going to serve. So we see that God actually values human freedom. He doesn't want people to serve him out of fear or because of force. He wants them to serve him freely. In the New Testament, Jesus teaches, he heals, but he never forces his way upon his society. In fact, he called people to follow him. He called people to believe in him, but he never forced people to do that. And so as a result of that, the Pharisees didn't feel like he could be really the Messiah, because they expected a Messiah that would use power and force to bring about a transformation to society. That somehow his power and influence would be so undeniable, so overwhelming, that the enemies of God would simply fall away, and that he would impose a whole new system. But Jesus didn't do that. He let people choose. He let people come to him because of their own faith. So we see Jesus actually protecting this principle of human freedom. And for the church all of a sudden to become politically active, trying to impose its way through laws and regulations, is undermining of Christianity itself. And it causes us to return to the Middle Ages, when Christianity used the political system to create a Christian state. And we saw that the consequences of that were actually very detrimental. People lost their right to think and to worship as they pleased, and that was totally contrary to what Christ taught. What's interesting is that Christians have actually been working very hard at this since World War II. And it's really, in a way, climaxing right now, beginning the climax, I guess you'd say, with the House Republican tax bill. This tax bill has now been passed by not just the House, but also the Senate. And in that tax bill, they have included a mandate that would allow the churches to endorse political candidates. Now, this is rolling back a law that was introduced in the 1950s by Johnson, Senator Johnson at the time, and it's called the Johnson Amendment. And this really bars candidates churches from supporting, endorsing political candidates. This law would be very detrimental to the separation between church and state, because it gives churches more and more influence in the political discourse. And there are a lot of people who follow what the church says. And this would mean that the church would influence politics. And the church, of course, right now is becoming more and more interested in imposing its form of morality. And so we can see where this could lead. This could lead to America becoming more and more of a church state, which would be actually very detrimental to the freedoms that we value. So this, I believe, is a big crisis that humanity is facing. One of the last crises that I would like to point out is the nuclear threat. Now, there's been a lot of hard words exchanged between America and North Korea. And this has no doubt precipitated a crisis. Mr. Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has stated that the persistent war of words between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un is one of the reasons that nuclear war is more probable than ever. So the conflict between America and North Korea is being stoked. It's being stoked by this war of words between these two leaders who should actually be much more self-controlled and restrained in their use of words. We don't know where this is going. We don't know if it'll end up anywhere. Perhaps America and North Korea will find a way of agreeing. But both of these countries have expressed, either directly or indirectly, a willingness to use nuclear weapons to protect their own security. This kind of language is phenomenally dangerous because it can create the very situation that nobody wants to take place. So we're facing a great threat in this area. So we have these different threats that I'm pointing to, and the picture actually is much bigger than this. But when you look at them in total, you see that we're facing overwhelming problems that are only going to get worse. So we come back to the question, where are we heading really? You know, we also need to look at the fundamental reason for all of these crises, because in a way they all have a common cause. And I would propose that their common cause is actually the lawlessness that underlies our existence. You know, in the book Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 24, 5 through 6, the prophet sees into the future, and he describes the conditions that we are experiencing today. He says, the earth is also defiled under its inhabitants because they have transgressed the laws, they have changed the ordinance, they have broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore the curse has devoured the earth, and those who dwell in it are desolate. So he talks about the earth being destroyed, being devoured, and those who are living in it being impacted. And he tells us what is causing this. He's saying that we have changed the ordinance, we have changed God's law, we have transgressed his laws, we have broken our relationship with him, this covenant relationship. And because of this, the earth is being defiled. It's being destroyed. So the Bible actually finds the cause of all of this to be our breaking of God's law. Now, what is God's law? Well, the fundamental principle behind God's law is really love. It is respect. It is love. Love for each other, but also care for the world around us. This is the basic principle behind God's laws. Now, the Ten Commandments is an expression of some of love's fundamental principles. But I would suggest to you today that God's law is much broader and wider than any principles could really establish. Because God's law does not only describe our relationship to each other, but also our need to take care of the world around us. To treat everything with loving respect. So when we lose sight of love and respect, we result with all these different problems that we're talking about. So where are we heading? Well, we really need to not only ask this question in light of how this is going to impact mankind and some of the human results of this, but we also need to ask, where is God in all of this? You know, is God the cause of this? I mean, is God somehow behind it, orchestrating these horrible things? Is God totally uninterested in what's going on in our lives? Or does God have a plan for this world? Is God involved in what's going on here? Where is God in this situation? We really want to know about this. This is one of the main questions that I would like to look at. You know, where are we heading? Does God have a plan that will lead us in a certain way? Or are we totally up to our own? To answer some of these questions, we really need to have a source of knowledge about God and about his relationship with the world. You know, we can speculate a lot about those kind of things, but you know, unless God himself speaks, unless he shares with us what he's up to, we really can't know much about him. Now, the Bible actually says in one place that You know, before he acts, actually it's in the book Amos, before he acts, he reveals himself to the prophets. Before he does anything. So the Bible states explicitly that God reveals what he's up to. Now I think to understand why he does that, why he reveals himself, we need to go back to the fundamental principle that God is love. You see, love takes place through communication. It takes place through being involved in each other's lives, expressing our thoughts, engaging the other person's thoughts. The Bible says explicitly and demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt that God is love. And if God is love, then it's logical that he would express himself, that he would communicate with us in order to be involved in our lives and so that we can be involved in his life. The Bible actually claims to be God's word to us. So from the beginning to the end, it is his communication to us individually and collectively. He has communicated himself through 66 books, and each one of these books communicates a different facet about this amazing God who created this world. So to understand the fullness of God's relationship to mankind, we need all 66 books. In this seminar, we'll be looking at sections and passages from all these different books. But our focus will be on two books, the books Daniel and Revelation. Now these books really have an important place in the Bible because they predict worldwide events. And so to understand God's relationship to history, to all of history, to all of mankind, we need these two books. Because these books make that connection very clear. Now what's very interesting is that in the book Revelation, chapter 10, the Bible actually makes it explicit that Daniel and Revelation are intricately connected to each other and should be read together. In Revelation chapter 10, we have an angel standing with a book that's open. And if we read carefully chapter 10, we see that there are a lot of verbal connections with Daniel chapter 12. We have an angel standing. We have a book in the hand. We have a promise of sorts being made. There are many connections, and what's taking place here is that this book, instead of being closed like in Daniel chapter 12, is actually being opened. What's suggested here is that this book is actually Daniel's book. Daniel's book is being opened for mankind to understand. And he tells John, who's receiving these revelations, that he needs to eat this book. Now, the book of Revelation is a very symbolic book. And eating is used metaphorically in the Bible to refer to the whole idea of digesting or understanding. So it's a reference to man's cognitive process of trying to comprehend something and bring that knowledge into their lives. So the angel is telling him that he needs to take Daniel's book and understand Daniel's book. Now who is he saying this to? He's saying this to John. And John is the one receiving these visions in Revelation. So if you start to think about that, what the angel seems to be saying is that John needs to bring the book of Daniel into his understanding. So the revelations that God gives him need to be brought together with the revelations that Daniel was given. And then he's told to prophesy to many people, nations, and kings. So this message is to go out globally. So we can conclude thereby that we need to actually read Daniel and Revelation together, and this message, this combination message, is meant for all the nations. God wants people to hear this message. And so this is a mandate for us to study these two books and to hear these two books together. And so it makes it very clear that this is important for us. Now, Revelation begins with the idea that the book of Revelation is really a testimony of Jesus. God has given to Jesus, the Father has given to Jesus, everything that's revealed in the book of Revelation. And so the book of Revelation is his testimony. It is Jesus telling us what the Father has told him. And what has the Father told him? Well, in this passage, Revelation chapter 19:10, it tells us that the testimony of Jesus Christ, the book of Revelation, in other words, is the spirit of prophecy. So the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel are really prophetic. And what this is telling me, Jesus wants us to know this. This is his testimony to the world. He is testifying of his involvement in the world and his Father's involvement in the world. And he wants people to know that. Now the seminar, Prophecies of Hope, is really divided up into 4 different topics. And I like to call these modules, because they encompass many smaller topics. The first one is called World Events Foretold. The second is the Mystery Beast of Daniel and Revelation. The third is the Mark of the Beast. And the fourth is God Intervenes, Peace at Last. So I want you to know the 4 different main modules of this seminar, so you know where we're going with it. The first module basically has 4 parts to it. It lays the foundation for the rest of the seminar. I called it World Events Foretold, but actually the whole seminar is about World Events Foretold. But it really lays the outline of what we're going to talk about. And the very first seminar is, can God be trusted? This is kind of the question that I start the seminar with. But we'll be delving into a lot of material about the future. Seeing the Signs is the second one. Why does God allow suffering? Hope for a planet in crisis is the fourth. So these are all then part of the first module. Now before we go into the book of Daniel, because we want to start with the book of Daniel today, I want to give you a short biography of Daniel as a prophet. Now to understand the book of Daniel, I think it's really helpful to study his life, because Daniel is an extraordinary figure. You know, a lot of people hear about Daniel at Sunday school, and they have a very kind of maybe childish picture of Daniel. But Daniel was in fact a very serious and a very seminal figure. You know, he grew up as a Jewish prince in the house of David in Jerusalem. And so he was given opportunities that probably very few Jewish children had. We see that he was a very cultured, a very knowledgeable individual. Probably some of this came from his youth and the opportunities that he had. But then something very tragic happened in the life of Israel. And he was part of that. In the year 605, a lot of young men and many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem were exiled, were taken by the Babylonians to Babylon. And this was a national tragedy because it meant the end of the independence of Israel. It meant the end of the temple sacrifices and ceremonies, which symbolize God's redemptive action. It meant the end of Israel's autonomy as a people. And so Daniel, together with his friends and family members and the king and the nation were forced to become subservient to the Babylonians. So he was brought to a totally new culture, a totally new place, and had to start afresh here in Babylon. During this period, Daniel was given the best education in Babylon. He was perceived as an asset to the Babylonians. They wanted him and his colleagues to be trained in the Babylonian culture and administrative knowledge and science and religion so that they could be employed in the government. During this time, he was uncompromising in his devotion to God. And as a result of this uncompromising attitude, God actually blessed him with great wisdom. And he was exalted to a very high position, promoted to one of the highest positions in the whole Babylonian Empire. So he was a very prominent figure, not only in the Jewish circles, but also in the Babylonian circles, which was a world empire at that time. Daniel was a prophet. Daniel was given wisdom by God. He received revelations that allowed him to see into the future. And he was not just an ordinary Israeli prophet who had visions and dreams about Israel's future, but he was an apocalyptic prophet given portraits and pictures of what would take place across the globe. So he had a very wide and a very broad view of the future. In fact, what's very interesting is that God actually compares Daniel to Lucifer in terms of wisdom and knowledge. Lucifer was created to be one of the highest intelligences in the whole universe. But Daniel is compared to him, not that Daniel had the same amount of wisdom that he did, but that he wasn't so far away, so to speak. Daniel's visions don't only concern what would take place here on this earth. Daniel was given insight into things that were taking place behind the scene in the spiritual realm. And these things were having, these events in the spiritual and in the physical realm were of universal significance for the whole universe. And Daniel is given that kind of perspective on world history. What I find fascinating about his prophecies is that he's so accurate and so precise in what he has to say. He actually foretells the death of the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, the death of the Messiah, and many other important events, and gives the exact date for these events. You know, Daniel's book is really a masterpiece. It's not just a haphazard piece of literature. It was actually put together with great care. And the more you study the book, the more you realize that this is a masterpiece because the organization is just so brilliant and so beautiful. I just want to show you a picture. This picture comes from a book written by Jacques Toucan. He's a Jewish Adventist theologian. His book is called The Vision of the End. And in this book, he kind of tries to outline the basic organization of the book of Daniel. And when you study this organization, you see that it's really, really intricate. If you'll notice here, the chapters are numbered, chapters 1 through 12. And these lines show the connections between the chapters. And basically the book is organized into two concentric circles where you have a center, for example, 4 and 5 and 9 and 8. These are two foci, two central points. Chapters 4 and 5 are intricately connected. Chapters 9 and 10 are connected. And then basically it kind of radiates out from there. 8 and 11 are connected. 3 and 6 are connected. And then 2 and 7 and 7 and 12. So the more you understand these connections, the better you'll be able to understand the message of this book. Another way of organizing it is the picture on the bottom. that way of organizing is called chiastic structure, but basically it illustrates the same thing. So yeah, we have an incredible book here with deep knowledge that requires us to really connect all the dots to understand what the message is. Now, Jesus was very interested in the book of Daniel, and this should really motivate us to study the book of Daniel. You know, he encouraged the disciples to read and to understand it. When you look at his own preaching and his own teaching, he took a lot of his ideas and a lot of his concepts from the book of Daniel. He talked about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is mentioned frequently in the book of Daniel. It's one of the main themes. He talked about him being the Son of Man. This is also a concept that's used frequently in the book of Daniel. The judgment, the coming of the judgment, was a main concept in the book of Daniel. In fact, Daniel's name means God is my judge. So judgment is a very important component to the book of Daniel. And Jesus spent a lot of time explaining this and helping us to understand what the issues were in the judgment. As we saw already in the book of Revelation, it's revealed by Jesus that the book of Daniel should be read together with the book of Revelation. So the book of Daniel was very crucial to the Christian message. Now, having said all of this, it's very interesting to see that many scholars have paid special attention to the book of Daniel. You know, Sir Isaac Newton was one of them. Sir Isaac Newton is known for his laws of gravity. But he spent a good deal of time studying the book of Daniel. And he wrote a whole book on it. Observations, Prophecies, Daniel, Apocalypse of John. Just an amazing book. And so this was one of his passions, was to understand these prophecies. And this is what he says about the book of Daniel. Daniel is most distinct in order of time and easiest to be understood. And therefore, in those things which relate to the last times, he must be made the key to the rest. Now, this quote to me is very insightful because it shows us that Daniel is a kind of a key to unlock the mysteries of Revelation. Daniel speaks in very plain, easy to understand terms. And it lays out a kind of outline that will help us to understand the rest of apocalyptic Revelation. So this will be our key, and this is why we're beginning with this in the very first seminar. Now, I've devoted a little bit of time to the book of Daniel. I actually did my master's thesis and spent time researching in the libraries to try to understand the 11th chapter of Daniel. And I can tell you that Daniel is just such a beautiful and important book. And so I'm excited about this book. I'm excited about sharing the knowledge that God has revealed. And the more I study it, the more I realize how much more there is to know. We'll be using during the course of the whole seminar a series of study guides from It Is Written. And tonight we'll be talking about Can God Be Trusted? That's the title for this particular study guide, although we're actually interested in how Daniel predicts the future and what he says about the future. So if you will open with me to the first questions in the study guide. Now, the study guide is basically a series of questions and text that will answer those questions. And so that is the format that we'll be using during this part of my presentation today. First question that we'll be looking at is, how does God demonstrate that he can be trusted? This is a very important question because a lot of people don't trust God. They don't trust his word. They trust science because science is something they can test through their senses. But they believe that God's word is about spiritual realities that cannot be tested. And so they make this very black and white distinction between religion, faith, and science. But what's interesting is that God actually transcends this black and white and I believe inaccurate distinction between faith and science. He transcends it because he gives us a source of knowledge about himself that can be tested. Now, the source of knowledge is not the same as nature. The source of knowledge that God gives us are his own prophecies, his own foretellings of the future. You see, he has given to us knowledge about the future that we can test when the things come to fulfillment. And I believe this knowledge is just as reliable as the experiments that we do in nature to find out what is real and what is not real. The Bible actually says this in Isaiah 46, 9 and 10. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. So what is God saying here? Well, he's saying that he is God, and he is unique. There's no other God. And then he identifies the fact, or the realm of facts, which prove that he is God and there's no other like him. And the realm of facts, he says, is this: declaring the end from the beginning. So his foretelling the future is that realm of facts which prove that he is God and that there's none other like him. Because in reality, humans can predict some things short term, but often make mistakes, often don't see things coming. I mean, the future is unknown to us. But God actually stands and tells us things about the future that human beings could never know. And so he separates himself from humans. He shows that he is indeed God, the Creator. So as we study the prophecy that we're going to be looking at today, we need to understand that this is all about teaching us to trust in him and to know that he is God. We're going to jump into the book of Daniel here, into the second chapter. In the second chapter, we have some prophecies that really help us to trust in God and to know that he is real and to know what is going to happen. So let's look at the first question regarding the book of Daniel. In the story of King Nebuchadnezzar, how did God reveal his trustworthiness? Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. So God gave Nebuchadnezzar some dreams that really troubled Nebuchadnezzar, and he had a hard time sleeping. And it's through these dreams that God was revealing the future to him and was revealing that he was trustworthy, as we're going to see. So God has a way of breaking into our lives when we least expect it. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was not a worshiper of the Creator God. He had his own political, religious ideologies that were linked to his own power. But these were human gods. But God was interested in him. God wanted his attention, and so he gave him these dreams. Now, what was Nebuchadnezzar's reaction when his counselors could not interpret his dreams? Daniel 2:10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean." Now, Nebuchadnezzar was really demanding of the Chaldeans that they tell him what he had dreamt and that they interpret what he had dreamt. So he was not telling them what he had dreamt. And they were saying, "It is impossible for us to read your mind, to read your dream." No human being can do this. Even the magicians, the astrologers, and the Chaldeans. Now, these people were people who had connection to the spiritual world. They were the intellectuals of that day and age. In that day and age, magic and scientific knowledge were connected. They were inextricably linked. These were the people that the kings had as his advisors. He trusted them. But for whatever reason, he decides to put them on trial, to give them a demand which they couldn't actually follow through with. And they tell him, there's no man who can do this. As a result of this, we read in Daniel chapter 2:12, for this reason the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He was acting quite unreasonable. He should have known this ahead of time. What's very interesting is that the Chaldeans, in part of their explanation, I don't have it here, basically say that they don't have a close enough connection with the gods to be able to give this knowledge. You would have thought he would have known this, and you would have thought that he would accept it. But he expresses a rage at this fact and this reality. Now, Daniel, he was a political prisoner, being trained to be one of Nebuchadnezzar's servants in his administration. And Daniel hears about it. And because of his faith, he decides he needs to do something. And so in Daniel chapter 2, 17 and 18, we read this. Then Daniel went to his house, made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning the secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had actually changed their names because he was making them part of his kingdom. But here in this text, actually, their Jewish names are mentioned. And it says here that they sought God. They sought God's mercies because they believed that God could help them. And this implies that they had a close relationship to God. You see, the magicians felt like they were too far from God to have this kind of knowledge. Whereas these individuals believed that they could have a close relationship with God and that God was interested in them enough to help them. And in fact, in Daniel chapter 2:19, it is written, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Now, if you just notice in all these passages, Daniel talks about himself in the third person because Daniel was writing his book as a historian. It was not a personal testimony, even though it was, but he was writing it as a historical account, and so he uses the third person. So God gives Daniel a night vision to reveal what God had revealed to Nebuchadnezzar. And so Daniel is just ecstatic and thankful, and he blesses God for what he had done. Now we're going to be looking at this vision, because this vision is a fundamental building block for understanding all of God's apocalyptic prophecies about the future. How did Daniel describe this king's dream? Daniel chapter 2:31. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and his form was awesome. So Daniel sees this vision, and he says to Nebuchadnezzar that this is what you saw. And in your vision, you were watching. So your eyes were open. You were able to see things. And behold, you saw an image. Now, an image is a physical, artistic creation that represents something else, right? So he sees this statue, this great statue, that was actually splendid. It was excellent. It says its form was awesome. Now, the word translated here in the New King James Version It actually has the meaning of fearful. This image, this representation, was very fearful. So the reality that is being represented here is a very fearful reality. It represents perhaps the best of what mankind could produce. But it was a very fearful reality. You know, living on this planet is not easy. Human history has been filled with wars and desolations and destructions. Human history is filled with tyranny and pain and suffering. And most of it, or much of it, is caused by human beings and the way they treat other human beings. And we're going to be looking at a history that's full of hardships and difficulties. But it's the very best that mankind produced. So, we have the statue, and the statue is an image because it represents something else. So what were the elements that made up the image? So if we're going to understand what the image represents, we just need to have it clear in our mind what this image was made out of. Daniel chapter 2, 32 and 33. This image's head was of gold, of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So we have here a statue that is made up of different kinds of metals. Right? Notice how the metals start with the most valuable kind of a metal. Then it goes to a metal that's of less value, and then even less value. And then we have the last kind of metal, which is iron. Notice how in the very last part, in the feet, you have actually a mixture of iron and clay. So here we have the introduction of a new element that is totally different than the other elements. Right? Gold, silver, bronze, iron, they're all metals. But in the last part of this image, you have the introduction of clay. Very interesting. We're going to be looking at the meaning of these different metals and of the clay. So before we look into that particular issue, what happened to this great image? Well, Daniel chapter 2, 34 and 35. You watched while a stone was cut out with hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The winds carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So here we have this dramatic event. The statue looked like it was indestructible. It was the best man could offer. It was fearsome. Nobody wanted to touch it. But then you have the stone coming from heaven. So we have the introduction of a new element here. And this element, instead of being of this earth, is a heavenly element that comes and breaks the statue. It hits the statue at the feet. And it breaks it. And the pieces, the millions of pieces, are like dust. And they're blown by the wind, so no trace could be found. So basically, this heavenly element destroys, completely destroys. In fact, we have to use the word annihilates the statue. Nothing is left. It's carried away, so not even a trace of it could be found. Now, this is either good news or bad news, right? Depending on what this prophecy means, this is either good news or bad news. I think a pretty good guess is that this is good news because this was a statue that created fear in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel said it was a fearsome statue, so it wasn't just something that created fear in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar, but its very essence was that of fear. And so it would seem on the surface to be the end of what is most troubling to mankind, to be the end of something bad and the beginning of something good. So let's see if we can try to understand what this prophecy is all about. So what does the head of gold represent? Let's start with the beginning. Daniel chapter 2:38. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler of them all. You are this head of gold. So the head of gold represents Nebuchadnezzar. Now Nebuchadnezzar was the monarch of Babylon. And Babylon was a great, great kingdom. And this kingdom lasted from about 605 BC to 539 BC. So it had a very big role to play in the Middle East for about 66 years. Let me just show you a map of this empire. I hope the colors are clear enough for you to see. But you see this empire expanded over a very large territory and embraced many different kingdoms. And Nebuchadnezzar and his after generations, they governed this with a very strong hand, trying to assimilate all these different cultures into the Babylonian Empire. So Nebuchadnezzar was to be the beginning, and Nebuchadnezzar was the head of the Babylonian Empire. So we can very easily conclude that Babylon is the head. The gold represents the Babylonian Empire. But this vision tells us something very important. Let's read the next step. What did Daniel predict would happen to Babylon? Daniel 2:39. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. Now, I don't think Nebuchadnezzar had expected this in his dream, to be told that his kingdom would come to an end. No, he was building his kingdom with the expectation that this would last forever and ever. But like everything else human, it would come to an end. So this was probably somewhat fearful for him, somewhat disconcerting for him. But I mean, the whole statue was fearful. It wasn't just his end and the end of his kingdom which was fearful. It says here that another kingdom would take over. We know from history, and history is very clear about this, that the Babylonian Empire would be taken by the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians, they came from Iran, what is now today Iran. And it was basically King Cyrus who conquered. King Cyrus is known in the annals of history for being a great leader, a great king. In fact, he was a quite humane leader. He didn't force people to give up their religions. He actually allowed them to keep their religion. So he was a very tolerant leader. And in fact, his approach to things was studied by European kings and even the founders of the American Republic. They were inspired by his example of tolerance. They read it through Herodotus. They read it through other works. Cyrus was actually predicted to take over by the prophet Isaiah, hundreds of years before he actually did it. I want you to look briefly at Isaiah 45, which predicts Cyrus, actually gives his name even before he was born, and says that he would take over. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. So King Cyrus, together with his general Darius, they were able to conquer Babylon in a most extraordinary way. And this was predicted long before he actually did it. And as you'll see from that picture, let me just go back, kind of jump too quickly, you'll see that his empire was even larger than the empire of the Babylonians. What metal was used to represent the third kingdom, the nation that would take over from Medo-Persia? Well, bronze was used. Daniel 2:39. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. We look at history. The very next kingdom that came into the story was the kingdom of Greece. Alexander conquered and overcame the Greek Empire. And he won with actually far less resources. You know, he fought the Medo-Persian Empire at a battle where the Medo-Persians were arrayed in vast numbers before him. And he had a relatively small force. And he was able to somehow penetrate their line and almost come from behind. And he succeeded because he moved very quickly. In fact, by, I think, the age of 31, he had conquered almost all the way to India. So his kingdom advanced quickly. We see from this picture that his kingdom went all the way to India. One of the interesting facts is that Alexander, of course, he was known throughout the empire, he actually went to Jerusalem. And Josephus writes this. You know, he was a Jewish historian. He says that, and when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. Very interesting that Alexander would hear about the book of Daniel and would be so joyous at what he had heard. So people have been studying the book of Daniel for millennia, for generations. And when it was fulfilled, they could see that it was being fulfilled. So very interesting. What metal was used to represent the fourth kingdom? And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that the kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Well, in the year 168, the Romans conquered the Medo-Persian Empire. And their empire became enormous. So here we have iron representing the Roman Empire. And the Romans used iron extensively. Now, how is the breakup of the Roman Empire described in this prophecy? So the Roman Empire lasted for about 644 years, but eventually it started fragmenting, started dividing. Daniel chapter 2, 41, 42. Whereas you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it. Just as you saw the iron mixed with the ceramic clay, and as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. So this tells us that this kingdom would be divided up into many parts. In fact, it talks about 10 parts, right? The 10 toes. Indeed, that's exactly what happened. The Roman Empire was divided up into basically 10 regions by different barbarian tribes that came in and conquered different parts of the Roman Empire that we see here in Europe. We have the Lombards in Italy. We have the Franks in France and Germany. We have the Alemanni in Germany. We have the Burgundians in Switzerland, and Anglo-Saxons in England, and Suevi in Portugal, and the Visigoths in Spain. So these were all tribes that took over. And there were basically 10. Now, could a Roman Empire, a secular Roman Empire, ever exist again? So this last stage was a time of division, right, when the kingdom would be divided. And eventually these barbarian tribes would organize their kingdoms, and the kingdoms would eventually become the European nations that we have today. But the question is, could this ever be united? Well, in Daniel 2:43, it says, "As you sow iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." We talked already about the 10 toes. The 10 toes represent these different barbarian tribes that divided up the Roman Empire. Here we have two other elements in the prophecy, the ceramic clay and the iron. What do they represent? They seem to represent something else than the 10 tribes. The ceramic clay is kind of trying to hold everything together, right? Because these chips or these fragments of iron, they can't be bound together by themselves, but they're trying to be fused. There's a kind of attempt to fuse the iron by using ceramic clay. What is this all about, actually? Well, this is a very good question. We'll be looking at that because there was an attempt to unite Europe. So what does this iron-clay mixture actually speak to? Well, in the preceding kingdoms, each of the elements, the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron, had a representative function. They represented different political empires. So in this context, it becomes likely that the element of clay should also have its own particular symbolic role. Up until now, the metals represented political powers. Clay, on the other hand, represents then a power of an essentially different nature that would try to unite these fragments of Rome into one. Now, what does this clay represent? It's different than the ones that came before it. But what does it represent? Jacques Ducan, in his book, The Secrets of Daniel, he gives to me a very good explanation based upon other biblical sources that can help us to understand this. And we'll see that this interpretation is actually justified when we study other chapters in Daniel. Those other chapters will confirm this interpretation. Now, Daniel specifies that the clay is potter's clay. Scripture uses the image of clay, especially potter's clay, in the context of creation. Yet the Lord, you are our Father. So the idea that He is our origin, our source. We are the clay. Right, when He created Adam, He created us out of clay. You are the potter, we are the works of your hands. Okay, so we see here that clay is used to represent the fact that we are from Him. He is our source. And He also shapes us through history. So through providence, He shapes us. So it kind of points to two things. It points to Him as our Creator and as our Lord. Now, when the Bible employs the word clay, it is always associated with the word potter, and always evokes the human person in a relationship of dependence upon the Creator. So the relevance of clay thus has a strong religious connotation. We have good reason to believe that clay at the base of the statue represents a different power of a religious nature through association with the political symbolized by iron. So we have here the religious being associated with the political, the religious trying to unite all these fragments together. On a historical level, this means that following the dissolution of the Roman Empire, a new power would take over, a religious one, though related more or less to the political power of Rome. So this is what we should expect, and this is what we indeed find to be true. One scholar says that the political maneuvers of Constantine the Great about the uniting of church with the state were taken up by the nations of Western Europe and developed further. The church was made a state within a state, imperium imperio. Quite a number of scholars consider this as one of the most particular characteristics of Europe. So what is being said here is that what defines Europe in a way is the fact that you would have a church power, a religious power, which is a state within a state. So this religious power would be a smaller part of a larger state. You know, these different political powers. And it would have actually autonomy. Now, what we can see through European history is actually the church and the state, they coexisted side by side. They were like two different societies. The church was a society in itself. The church had its own head, the Pope, and the different kings had their own heads. And there were two different administrations. They had two different sets of laws. The church had its canon law, and the government had its law that recognized the law of the church and actually incorporated many of its elements into its law. So we have then these two power structures in Europe side by side with each other, right? Clay and iron, coexisting. Not only that, but we actually will see that in European history, the church, the clay, tried to dominate over the kings, over the iron, and tried to unite the kings, tried to unite the iron into one. So history demonstrates the fact that, yes, Europe has had these two coexisting powers, the clay and the iron together. And the clay has tried to unite, but it's tried to unite everything together on the basis of Christianity, on the basis of religion, or I should say on the basis of a political version of Christianity, which is different than the true Christianity, because Jesus was not interested in politics. So just to summarize that, one scholar says, in short, the whole of Western Christendom formed in a certain sense a kingdom, with Pope and Emperor at the head. The first, however, was continually increasing in power and dominance. So the Pope was relatively impotent, relatively weak, but as time went on, he increased in power and dominance through religious influence and coercion. Now, in 494 AD, Pope Gelasius wrote to Emperor Anastasius. This is the Emperor of Rome at that point, declaring the theory of two swords or two powers governing the world. So within Catholic circles, within the Pope circles, they were developing this idea of Europe being a place with two power structures, the church and the state, and that both had their respective realms. Here are some words from what the Pope said. There are two by which the world is chiefly ruled. So he really saw that there were two ruling power structures, the sacred authority of the bishops and the royal power. Interesting the kind of language he's using here. He's not talking about the church as being a family, the church as being a kind of gentle institution, but really as being a ruler, right? Of those, the responsibility of bishops is more weightier insofar as they will answer also for the kings of men themselves at the divine judgment. So he felt that the church was of a more weightier power. In other words, he was putting himself and the church above the kings, that they were answerable actually to God for both realms. So one scholar says the popes did not claim to wield the temporal sword, but to direct its proper use. The two-sword theory maintained that secular leaders were subject to the pope's spiritual authority. So the pope was really putting himself up above the kings. The pope would not himself use the sword, but he could direct the kings to use the sword in the right way. So here we have developing the idea of papal supremacy, the fact that the pope was above the kings. You know, there were many events that led to this development. You know, the ideas were being developed, of course, but then there were also events happening to make this a reality. Some more ideas that were introduced after this that furthered this agenda that the Pope had. Well, in 495, Pope Gelasius was the first Pope to be declared the Vicar of Christ. I mean, this is quite amazing, actually. Vicar being like the representative, you know, the one who was in place of. So if he was in place of, that means that he had the full authority of Christ. Then in 501, the church announced that no human court could judge the Pope. So he was actually beyond the judgment of any king, which meant that he could do basically as he pleased. In the year 508, a very crucial event happened that really brought all of this into the political realm. Clovis, the king of the Franks, so this was actually a Germanic tribe, he was converted. He became a Catholic. And his conversion represented a major change. He was the first of these barbarian tribal leaders to be converted. He recognizes the church's sovereignty in the spiritual domain, and he also made his kingdom into a religious kingdom. So his conversion led to his kingdom becoming a Catholic kingdom. And so now he begins to recognize the Pope as being above himself. And so this is the beginning of all of Europe becoming Roman Catholic and recognizing the supremacy of the Pope. This is another great event. In the year 800, Charlemagne, otherwise known as Charles the Great, a very religious follower of the Pope, was crowned Imperator Romanium, Emperor of the Romans, by Pope Leo III. So he becomes Western Europe's Christian Caesar, a Roman emperor born of a Germanic race. So here we have actually the Pope wanting to create a new Roman Empire run by one of these Germanic kings. So the West once again had an emperor, and he was coronated by the Pope himself. So the Pope then places himself above this emperor, because previously actually the emperors were actually above the Pope. They often meddled in the affairs of the church. But through this act, the Pope was really raising himself above the emperors. And this source goes on to talk about how the fact that Charlemagne received his crown from the Pope was seen by the populace as equal to a divine bestowal. It confirmed the perception that the imperial crown was a papal gift, and the kingdoms of the earth belonged to the Bishop of Rome. They were his to give and his to take away. By this, there had been a formal linking of the Pope's spiritual power with the emperor's temporal power, and the two had become joint sovereigns on earth in a holy Roman Empire, which was the political foundation of the Middle Ages. So the entire future of the continent was bound up in this coronation, and the alliance between the papacy and Germany has been of great significance ever since. So Germany became really the center of this holy Roman Empire, which spread through Europe and became a massive influence in Europe. And it was all tied to the papacy, which tried to bind Europe together. Now, this Holy Roman Empire was not that strong. It was decentralized. The kings, the different local kings, they had also power. And so the emperor really wielded limited power. But he did wield power and influence. And so through this, the Catholic Church, the Pope, exerted a lot of influence. Now in 1530, Charles V he was a Habsburg, was crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor. And this was the last time that the Pope would actually coronate and crown the Holy Roman Emperor. After him, the empire sort of shriveled up and fragmented. But he built an empire that was extensive, that stretched from Vienna to Peru. And he pursued tirelessly the ideal of a unified Christian empire. And he achieved the first truly great empire, only to be thwarted by the Italian Renaissance with its questioning. So this was a major event. The last Holy Roman Emperor was actually Francis II. He decided to fold up the empire when he was conquered by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz in the year 1806. So he dissolved this whole empire. But you know, this empire had lasted for a long time. It had succeeded in uniting a lot under the emperor, under the pope. But people didn't give up this vision of uniting the empire. Napoleon continued this dream of resurrecting the Holy Roman Empire in Europe. And he considered himself to be the heir, the successor to the Caesars and to Charlemagne. And so he bestowed the title of Rome upon himself. And in 1804, he summoned the Pope to come to bestow upon him leadership. But in a highly significant, symbolic act, he took the crown and he placed it upon himself, showing that he didn't want a Europe where the Pope was above him, but he wanted a Europe where he had sovereign power. But you know, he never accomplished this. He was himself conquered in 1815 at Waterloo. But he says, I wanted to found a European system, a European code of laws, a European judiciary that would have been one people throughout Europe. So Napoleon played a very significant role in the church's diminution of power and influence. You know, in the year 1798, he actually captured the Pope. His general Berthier captured the Pope, and this was kind of a symbolic act that showed that the Pope's influence and power was ending. And this new idea was starting, the idea of states that were sovereign, that weren't under the church. And these states' powers would continue this ideal of uniting Europe, just like the church had this ideal. You have several dictators who had this ambitious goal of continuing the Reich, the empire, the Holy Roman Empire. They understood the vast importance of the papacy. Even Napoleon understood the importance of the papacy in this and didn't totally divorce himself from it. So they all wanted to recreate the Holy Roman Empire. And they kept up ties with the church. The EU is also a continuation of this great dream and ambition. And you can read sources that show clearly that the Roman Church plays a role. The leaders of Europe, they believe that the Roman Catholic Church is a cohesive element in Europe. It provides a common religion to hold Europe together politically. The Pope also believes this too, and perceives himself to be a uniting element, and believes in this project of uniting all of Europe together. Pope John Paul said, Europe, despite its present and long-lasting divisions of regimes, ideologies, and economic systems, cannot cease to seek its fundamental unity and must turn to Christianity. Economic and political reasons cannot do it. We must go deeper. So the Pope believes that the only true way of uniting Europe is by going deeper. Economic systems cannot do it alone. We need to have a common religion. We need to unite it on Christianity. So the Roman Catholic Church sees itself as playing a very big role in this, and has all the way back to Charlemagne and back to Gelasius, the Pope. So this is a long-term project that they have not given up. It's interesting that just in 2016, the EU recognized Pope Francis for his work in uniting Europe and gave him the prize, the Charlemagne Prize. You remember Charlemagne in 800? He was made the first Holy Roman Emperor. And the Pope was given a prize that recognizes his work in uniting Europe, just like Charlemagne tried to. And so Pope gave his I Have a Dream speech, where he talked about how he had a vision for Europe being one, and how the unity could only be created through a humanism. I dream of a new European humanism, one based on fresh ideas and a revamped economy that promotes integration and respect for human dignity. So when he used the term humanism, he's not talking about secular humanism. He's talking about Christian humanism. In other words, he's talking about the church's theology and the respect that the church's theology gives to humans. And he believes that Europe needs to be based upon the church's ideology, the church's theology. So again, this project of uniting Europe through Christianity is continuing. It has not been given up. Well, this project is very much a reality today, and we're going to see it unfold as time goes on. But the Bible says that this project is not a good project. It has never been a good project. In fact, it's part of this fearful history that only creates fear. Because the only way that you can unite Europe on the basis of religion is to force religion, is to make it a political thing, is to try to unite church and state. And the Bible says that this is not going to last forever, this whole project. In fact, it's going to come to an end. The Bible talks about what comes next. Who will set up history's final kingdom? Daniel 2:44. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So the Bible presents this as mankind's only hope. When you look at all the other stages of history, you see that all these kingdoms and empires, they were created through power and through force. Some people had to lose out for these kingdoms to go anywhere. And the only way they could be propped up was through this force. They have not created peace upon this earth. They have not created justice and righteousness. And so God does something radical. From heaven, he intervenes, and he brings an end to all these human empires, breaks them in pieces, brings them to a total end forever, and sets up a kingdom that's going to last forever. It shall stand forever. So this is the hope that God gives to the world. And if all the other prophecies were fulfilled, Babylon was foretold, Medo-Persia was foretold, Greece was foretold, Rome was foretold, the breaking up of the Roman Empire, and the influence of the church would play in European history. If all that is fulfilled, then we have a basis for believing in this last stage. Now, what's crucial is to understand that we are living in the last part of this statue. We're actually living in the fragmented Roman Empire during that time period, in that time period. And it's in that time period that this stone breaks everything apart. And so, we started with the question, where is everything tending? Where is everything going? Is God involved? And this prophecy demonstrates that yes, God is involved. But he gives freedom. He gave freedom for millennia, for centuries, for all these different kingdoms to form, to rule, and to fall apart. Showing that human ambition, human rules and regulations cannot create the ideal kingdom, cannot bring a lasting order of things. They all break apart, and they break apart for the same reason, because of a lack of love, because of a disregard for God's laws. And so he creates a kingdom that is based upon his own laws, a kingdom that will last forever. But before that kingdom can be established, all the other kingdoms have to be destroyed. And this kingdom will not be created by human beings on this earth. It'll be God who intervenes. What will happen to earthly kingdoms when God sets up his kingdom? And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So all the other kingdoms will be destroyed. The last question that we have for this meeting tonight, what did Nebuchadnezzar say about Daniel's God when he realized that Daniel could reveal the meaning of his dream? Daniel 2:47. The king answered Daniel and said, "Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret." Now, Nebuchadnezzar did not experience his kingdom being destroyed. He didn't see the Medo-Persians taking over. He didn't see the Greeks taking over the Medo-Persian Empire. He didn't see the Romans. He didn't see the Roman Empire being fragmented. He wasn't a witness to the stone coming. But because Daniel could tell him his dream and give him an understanding of what it meant, he was convinced that this dream was from God. We have even more reason to believe, because we have actually seen the fulfillment of his dream step by step, detail by detail. So when we look at the dream, we can say, yeah, this is an amazing fulfillment. And we can logically conclude that this has to come from God, because who else would have known all these things? And so shouldn't our response to this dream be the same as Nebuchadnezzar? Truly, your God is the God of gods. Shouldn't we worship him as the Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets? We have every reason to do that, because the evidence is there. The evidence is clear. And so this is why God reveals these things to us today. He wants us to trust in him. He wants us to know him as the trustworthy one, the one who is present in our lives and in this world. This is not just some political theory. No, this is a God who wants to have a relationship with us. He wants us to be like Daniel, who sought God, who had a relationship with him. He wants us to also have a relationship with him. And so I end this evening actually with an invitation. Do you want to have a relationship with this God who knows the future and who has better plans for you and I than any human can come up with? His plans are good because he is a God of love. He's a God of justice. And his plans will last forever and ever. Jesus is coming back. The Bible promises it. This stone represents the kingdom of Jesus. Jesus is going to set up his kingdom on this earth after he's destroyed the other kingdoms. And he's going to start afresh. There will be no discordant element. No evil will be allowed. This kingdom will be based on freedom, because all those who will be part of this kingdom will have freely chosen Christ as their Lord. Everything else will be destroyed, because everything else would bring desolation, destruction to God's kingdom. And so out of mercy, he must let everything else be destroyed. Otherwise, evil, fear, suffering would continue for eternity. And God cannot allow that to happen. If you want to be part of this kingdom, I would invite you to pray with me. Because this is what each one of us longs to be part of. This is mankind's hope. And so we want to be part of it. Let's pray together. Dear God, I thank you so much for these revelations. I thank you so much for the fact that we can be part of your kingdom. I just pray, dear Father, that you would take our lives. We want to give ourselves to you and to become your servants. And I just pray that you would accept us in Jesus, and that we might also be found worthy to be part of this kingdom. Thank you for the hope that you've given us through these prophecies. Help us to take this into our lives and to believe them. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.